question that I would direct to Galina. We have heard today, and also it's a common knowledge, that there is now widespread acknowledgement amongst governments, civil society, and progressive members of the business community that these mandatory comprehensive measures are needed in order to hold business actors accountable for actions in regards to sustainability. Now, I would ask you, what are the new contents of international public policy in this regard, in regard to compliance in environment and also human rights?
Thank you, Bella, for your question. And I think like two preliminary remarks call on my side, if not three. First one is obviously like it's a massive pleasure to be here in Sarajevo. This is my first visit, and I'm thankful for the invitation. And it's impressive to see this discussion here. It's very nice to see the city. So thank you so much. The preliminary remark number two is it is an extremely difficult task, I think, like for all of us, definitely for me, to speak after panel one and panel number two, because they have covered all our topics which we're supposed to cover. So we are really improvising here, and in my speech I will be making a lot of cross-references to panel number one and panel number two, basically saying I agree with what has been said before. And now coming closer to the question, right? I think like the question was posed in a way, you know, like how to, there's a consensus to hold business players accountable. And I think it's a negative, something like a negative in this question, right? Which calls like to categorization, you know, like there are good guys, i.e. the government, and there are bad guys, i.e. the business. And I think this is not a right characterization. You know, like if we go to this juxtaposition, I think we arrive nowhere. It's definitely, you know, like what we're trying to achieve can be achieved only through the joint efforts of all players, including the government, including the civil society, including businesses, and so on and so forth. So we should be, you know, like not trying to accuse anyone, but trying to find a solution to the problems we're facing. So here, I think, few aspects which I have to cover in my presentation. First one, and this is what has been already mentioned, there is a recognition that the governments have right to regulate, right? I think we cannot take away from the government this right, and this is their duty to regulate, you know, like to regulate, you know, like to set aims, climate change's aims for all of us as a society, and also regulate the behavior and duties of businesses, right? So a lot of treaties, a lot of framework agreements have been mentioned, you know, like obviously the ECT Treaty was mentioned, Energy Charter Treaty, the Paris Agreement was mentioned. The one big thing which hasn't mentioned in this conference so far is the outcome of a COP27, you know, like which was reported like these last days. And what I was reading yesterday on Instagram basically is that they also have reached the new climate deal, you know, like basically 200 countries signed to this, so we are still to read this. But this is something on a big public scale, this is what we have now. This is one way of regulating. Another way of regulating exactly is the behavior of the private players and of businesses. Not so much or exclusively in investment area, but generally. So here we have different initiatives, and I will mention only two initiatives which are moving forward, which are not the legislation in place. One is in the EU and another is in the United States, and which to a certain extent mirror each other. So we have a proposal, EU proposal for a directive on corporate sustainability and due diligence, which was adopted with proposal in February this year. And at the same time, we have US Securities and Exchange Commission proposal for rules to enhance and standardize climate-related disclosures for investors. So basically, what do we have here? You know, like both proposals aim at the large companies, like especially in the EU, there's like a definition of what is a large company under this proposal. These companies, they have to integrate ESG due diligence into all of their corporate policies and identify in their plans actual potential adverse impacts on human rights and environmental impacts of their of their businesses. So this will be a must, right? So this is how we're trying to regulate this area. The same thing is the United States, where the Commission proposed, SEC proposed rule changes that would require registrants to include certain climate-related disclosures in their registration statements and so on and so forth. So this is how the government regulates the place behavior. Now, if we move into the investment field, in the investment field, like obviously, like the specialist much better than I am in modern BITs, but BITs, like classical BITs, when we had provisions in relation to environment, normally these provisions contained in rather general language containing the duty, the obligation, the undertakings, good undertakings of the member states, of assigning signatories to the BITs to care also, like let's put it this way, about environment, but not duties of investors in this field. So now we see in new generations of BITs where duties are also imposed on investors. So let me look at one of the VITs, like one of the recent ones. So an example here is this language, like a classical language aimed at the state. Nothing in this agreement shall be construed to prevent a party, a state, from adopting, maintaining, or enforcing in a non-discriminatory manner any measures otherwise consistent with this agreement that considers appropriate to ensure that investment activity in its territory is undertaken in a manner sensitive to environmental and social concerns. So this is for a member state. From another side, investors shall conduct a social impact assessment of a potential investment. So this is number 2. And then later, what investors also have to do, investors and host state authorities shall apply the precautionary principle to their environmental impact assessment and to decision taken in relation to proposed investment. So, like this is a collaborative effort. The same principle of collaborative effort, the same principle of precautionary, like which we should apply in whatever we do in our business, is also incorporated in the new proposal for the Energy Charter Treaty modifications as kindly provided to me by Galina. So here we have a new Article 19, which is not called environmental aspects anymore, but sustainable development, and which says that recognizing the right of each contracting party to determine its sustainable development policies and priorities, to establish its own levels of domestic environmental and labor protection, and to adopt or modify accordingly its relevant laws and regulations, and so on and so forth, right? So this is, again, collaborative effort. So this is regulatory functions. Now we go what is happening in the investment fund. And here, like what I wanted to say, basically was covered by Ilya and Galina in the first panel. So arbitrators, they are not deaf to the sustainability or environmental concerns. Like one thing, as was correctly pointed out, is a big number of new investment cases brought under the specifically Energy Charter Treaty. Another thing is what is the outcome of these proceedings. As Galina has showed, like this is not like in all cases the member states, the countries are losing. Quite the opposite. Like it's only in 50% of cases roughly. Like it goes to one way or to another way, and obviously the damage which is awarded is not the original damage quantum claimed in these proceedings. So here what the tribunals have done, they looked, here I'm cross-referencing Ilya, right? They have to look what was, if there was at all, exact promise, exact undertaking given by the member states to a particular investor. Like what is the scope of a particular promise? If there was not a particular promise, but a regulatory framework addressed to all, then you have to look, like what kind of legitimate expectations could be created on the investor side, and then we have, of course, this is an analysis, like you have to go into this, but, like what is the scope of this and what is the extent of these legitimate expectations? And if you come to the conclusions that, yes, certain legitimate expectations were justified, then you have to go to the quantum. And this is, again, yet another analysis. And here, again, the arbitrators exercise certain not only discretion, but also restraint, I would say. So this is number 2 of my presentation, and like the third, like you mentioned, the term of international public policy. International public policy, some people would call it, other people would say like this is a different thing, transnational public policy. So I think here we have to ask, the first question is, what is this at all? You know, like, because public policy we understand, you know, like what is public law we understand, what is transnational or international public policy. So I try to identify it. So one of the definitions what I found, I will go for a short while, is an international consensus as to universal standards and accepted norms of conduct that must be applied in all forums. So it's a consensus. So we don't have a written rules in this respect. What is international public policy? A good example, an obvious example of international public policy was already mentioned in panel number 2. This is a corruption, right? I mean, this is true, and now we understand, you know, like no investment which was procured by corruption should be protected, let's put it this way, and rewarded if there is a stage of international investment arbitration, if there is a dispute. So far, so good, right? So are these concerns about environmental matters, sustainability, you know, like aims, objectives, and so on, also form part today of international public policy? And this is a question. And I would submit that we are in the process of creating the new scope, complementing this scope of international public policy. If we go back to the corruption, you know, like, I mean, there's a decision, one of the first decision given by Karl Lagerfeld in the 50s, you know, like when he said arbitrators don't have at all arbitrability, you know, like I don't have jurisdiction to rule on corruption matters. You know, like today, 60 years later, we take it for granted, you know, like, so back then in those days, it was still, you know, like the area which was not actually forming part of international public policy. And look, it took almost 60 years for us to arrive at a consensus that it is, right? So now we're in this, I would say, in this making process, you know, like whether environmental considerations, sustainability consideration, all also make part of international public policy. And how we are measuring this is difficult to measure, but we measure it by looking at what the arbitrators decide. We are looking massively into what the national courts decide, and again, there was like references to a lot of interesting decisions. And I think, you know, like this, what forms the scope of this new transnational public policy for the arbitrators and for the national courts alike. Here we have to be aligned in our reasoning, in our approach. Once again, you know, like we as arbitration specialists, as arbitration practice at all, generally, we are dependent on the states and state courts, tribunals, policy vis-a-vis us. So of course, if we as arbitration specialists, as counsel, as arbitrators, we are deaf to the concern of the general, like civil society, of the governments, to the climate objectives, to environmental, you know, like objectives, aims we're trying to achieve, we will lose legitimacy in this market. So we have to pay attention to this. And I think like this is somehow makes the background to all our discussion, but I think, again, I compliment panel number 1 and panel number 2 because a lot of these aspects were already brought up. Thank you.
Thank you, Galina. I just have one question to add on to that. You've mentioned the new generation BITs and the language that is more aspirational than a firm obligation that they contain. I mean, we can all agree not all of them, certain model VITs that are being negotiated do contain firmer language than others. But with this aspirational language contained therein, what do you believe that there would be room for the arbitral tribunals to make decisions which would be more in favor of protecting sustainability and denying benefits to these investors based on that language, or it would turn the table and go other way around?
No, of course. I mean, it goes per se, but I think these are all processes which are happening at the same time, you know, like, so there is a change, the change in the language of the BITs. You just have to take it into account. You have to take, you know, like, I mean, you have to understand and you have to give weight to the fact that the language has been change. You know, like you cannot just ignore the changes in the legislative framework. When, of course, there's, as I said, like there's like a number of conventions, there's like regulatory initiatives by the different states, which again reflect each other. You know, like maybe there will be, and there always will be, discrepancies between one jurisdiction and another one, but of course, I mean, mandatorily, arbitrators will have, and I think like we already do, pay concern to these changes because, and here we come to the institutional rules, I mean the general principle of arbitration as such, but also arbitration rules, your primary objective, or one of the primary objectives as an arbitrator is an award which will be enforceable. Right? So if the party will go to the state courts and say it's not enforceable because it just disregards the legislative framework of this country, disregards completely, you know, like the aims which we're trying to sustain and, you know, like to which the government has subscribed, then this award will fly out of a window. Like, and not only this particular arbitral tribunal will suffer, you know, like for the reputational loss and so on, but the entire arbitration practice, right? I think so. So, for sure, you know, like the answer to your question is for sure they have to pay attention. Thank you.